But let's talk about everything in order. The small Pitcairn Islands are located in the South Pacific Ocean. This is a small archipelago consisting of 4 islands, but our story will be about Pitcairn Island, which gave the name to the entire archipelago. This is a very small island, with an area of only 5 square kilometers. It is covered with rocks and cliffs of volcanic origin, as well as dense tropical jungles. And this place quite falls under the characteristics of a paradise island. The temperature there is kept within plus 25 degrees Celsius all year round. There is surprisingly a lot of fresh water on the island, everything blooms and grows with exuberant growth. And of course, such a fabulous place could not remain without attention. Back in the 11th century, Polynesians did not settle on Pitcairn. Apparently, they were Tahitians. They founded a settlement here, brought pets, and lived quite well. The drink does not have large reserves of obsidian. These first islanders most likely flourished due to the obsidian trade with the inhabitants of Mangareva Island, which was 500 kilometers away from them. They may even have sworn allegiance to the kings of Mangareva. Such a happy life lasted for 400 years. And then the obsidian reserves were depleted. There was a civil war on Mangareva, and Pitcairn society slowly began to fade. And when the Europeans arrived there, this island had been uninhabited for many years. And now we turn to the key event of our history. To the voyage of the Bounty ship. It was 1787th year, and Britain is undertaking a very cunning operation. The fact is that England owned extensive colonies in the Caribbean, where they imported a huge number of slaves for sugar cane plantations. But the trouble was that the poor soil of the Caribbean simply could not feed so many people. European food crops, such as oats, grain, and so on, did not take root on the islands, and the colonies began to face famine, and subsequently hunger riots. And then the British decide that the breadfruit tree, whose fruits were supposed to replace bread for the locals, will be the salvation for the West Indies from hunger. It was for the seedlings of this strategically important plant that the English bounty ship was sent, under the leadership of Captain William Bligh. This ship was supposed to get to Tahiti, where, in fact, the breadfruit tree grows, collect seedlings there, load them on board, and thereby save the colonies from starvation. A few words probably need to be said to thaw out those years, otherwise you just won't understand the atmosphere. Having gone ashore, the English sailors saw a blooming island, the most friendly locals, and even more friendly local women, who had very peculiar and free sexual mores. Tahiti was simply bursting with food and rum, which the locals brought to the English sailors as a sign of respect. And it is obvious that after the prim English mores, after the grey sky of London, the mud of the ports, and the eternally hungry life of a sailor, this island seemed to them a real paradise. And when the officers told the sailors to get ready for the return trip and load on the ship, not everyone wanted to return. Finally, after 24 weeks, having collected 115 breadfruit seedlings, on the 5th of April, 1789, the bounty ship completed its mission and set off on its return journey, leaving Tahiti behind. However, on the 28th of April, a riot broke out on the ship in the middle of the ocean. Its leader is a man named Fletcher Christian. And it wasn't a pirate-looking sailor. He was the deputy captain, an officer from a wealthy London family, who enjoyed great support from the team. Links to these platforms can be found in the description under this video. Only thanks to you, new videos on this channel continue to be released regularly. And in general, the channel continues to exist. Many thanks to everyone who has already responded and supported us. And many thanks to everyone who will respond and join our team. The peasant had run-ins with the captain before. Once he accused him of stealing coconuts and almost brought him to tears. And according to Fletcher himself, he even threatened to whip him with rods. In addition, the deputy captain was already practically married to a Tahitian woman, and he was not alone in this. Many sailors wanted to stay in Tahiti. But if you imagine these rioters as John Silver's pirates, then you are not quite right. Yes, there were most of the sailors, but there were also junior officers. These were often the children of rich aristocrats, who were taken on this voyage, so to speak, by the gang. Parents attached their children to the ship so that they would get naval experience and make a good officer career. But, apparently, even the children of rich aristocrats imbued with the atmosphere of Tahiti. Many of them have already cohabited with local women, and some even with more than one. Without these officers, the mutiny would have simply choked, because the sailors did not know how to use maps, navigation devices, and, in general, guide the ship somewhere. But since junior officers also participated in the riot, it was successful. These mutineers landed Captain Bligh, the officers and part of the crew who did not support them on the boat, and abandoned them in the ocean. And they turned bounty back to Tahiti. However, when they got to the Paradise Islands, they quickly began to realize that they were acting on emotions, so to speak. And soon a punitive expedition would come for their heads, and they will hang out on the yards, as befits the rebels of those years. A conflict arose, during which the rioters were divided into two groups. One, led by Midshipman Peter Heywood, decided to stay in Tahiti. And the second group, led by the main conspirator Fletcher Christian, who started all this mess, boarded the bounty ship, and decided to escape from justice somewhere else. However, let's go back to the boat that was abandoned in the middle of the ocean for a while. Captain Bligh and his loyal crew were in it. She was hanging out in the ocean 56 kilometers from the nearest island of Taua. At first, Bligh headed to this island in the hope of replenishing provisions and water supplies. But the natives on it turned out to be extremely hostile, and one crew member died in a collision with them. And Bligh and his team managed to miraculously escape by sailing away from the island. And for 48 days, an experienced captain led the remnants of his team to salvation. Out of 18 people, he lost only one. And in the end, the boat was saved. After some time, the sailors and the captain were in England, where everything was reported. Bligh, in fact, cannot be called a lucky captain. He will have to go through another shameful mutiny later, the so-called rum riot, but this time in Australia. However, his fate. This is a separate story. In England, they learn about the mutiny and organize a punitive expedition. The warship Pandora enters the Pacific Ocean. For the capture and delivery of the rebels to the court in England, the bounty ship, which he safely does. The 14 sailors who remained in Tahiti on the 23rd of March, 1791, were arrested and brought to trial, where, by the way, 4 of them were acquitted. The rest were sentenced to the gallows, but at the last moment, the king pardoned 2 people. Among them was Officer Peter Heywood, one of the instigators of the riot. His rich and influential relatives stood up for him. Subsequently, he would even become a captain and write one of the most extensive and detailed dictionaries of the Tahitian language. But unfortunately, the punitive expedition did not find the bounty ship of the Royal Navy in Tahiti, which was their main goal. Locals said that before they sailed away, cows, chickens, pigs, goats, and even cats were loaded onto the bounty, as well as seedlings of useful plants. There were 9 crew members left on the ship. They took with them 6 Tahitians, whose status differed little from slaves, as well as 12 Tahitians. And each of the Europeans got a woman, but the 6 slaves only 3. And realizing that they will be hanged in any of the colonies, the ship goes to look for a new life. And for this purpose, the new captain of the ship, Fletcher Christian, chooses the small island of Pitcairn, which was discovered only 20 years ago. Entries from the logbook of Captain Philip Carteret, who discovered this island. We found land to the north of us. When approaching the island the next day, it looked like a large rock towering over the sea. And since this land was discovered by a young gentleman, the son of a Marine Major Pitcairn, we named it Pitcairn Island. Because of the strong surf, we can't dock and explore this island. And it seemed that this island was the perfect place to hide. His position was mapped with an error. It was far from shipping lanes. There was no bay on the island where a warship could dock, and the island as a whole could only be approached by boat. The island had fresh water, It was green, blooming, and with a gorgeous climate. And the mutineers from the Bounty ship decide to stay here. The new settlers appreciated the island. It was really a paradise place. There they found the fruits of the breadfruit tree, planted sweet potatoes and yams, which they brought with them. The settlers built several houses and divided the land among themselves. By the way, the land was quite fertile. However, the British divided it into 9 parts. The Tahitians didn't get a single piece, and, obviously, their discontent was growing. Apparently, in Tahiti, the sailors promised them that they would be full members of the team. However, once on Pitcairn, the Tahitians actually became slaves. Their women were taken away from them, they worked constantly, and they were not given even a pathetic piece of land. And on top of everything else, one of the sailors named McCoy learned to drive moonshine from local plants. And to the already strong tension among the team, there was also widespread drunkenness. And then a very important event happens. During the first year on the island, the Tatyan spouses of sailors John Williams and John Adams die. And the British take 2 women from the Tahitians, whom they, by the way, considered their wives. Tahitian men have only 1 young lady left. As a result of all these unfair actions, the Tahitian men conspire to kill the English at night. However, the women betray them and tell the sailors everything, as a result of which 2 of the 6 Tatyans are killed. There are only 4 of them left, and they are enslaved again. By September of 1793, several children had already been born on the island. The 4 remaining Polynesian men now had only 1 woman. According to some sources, her name was Mareva. The British treated them worse and worse, and on the 3rd of October, 1793, Tahitian men raise a riot among the rioters. Their first victim was John Williams, followed by Fletcher Christian, John Mills, Isaac Martin, and William Brown. One of the sailors, John Adams, was wounded, but managed to survive, and with 3 of his English comrades, took refuge in the jungle. And then the real madness begins. The Tahitians turned out to be no better than the British. Some sources say that Tahitian women killed Thai men at night, because they turned out to be even more cruel than the British. However, this is not quite true. The Tahitians simply started a massacre among themselves for the possession of women and land. In addition, the 4 Englishmen who were hiding in the jungle also did not sit idly by, and wanted to return the island under their control. As a result, Taimuya, a Tatyan, was shot by Manarius, a Tahitian, because of a woman. Monnery was then shot by sailor William McCoy during a sortie. One of the women, perhaps it was Tarara, killed a Thai from Tahiti, and Edward Young shot the last one named Dio. And Pitcairn Island belonged to the British again. Moreover, none of the Polynesians had any children left. There were only 4 Englishmen left on the island out of the men. The inhabitants of the island were Edward Young, Matthew Quintal, John Adams, and William McCoy, as well as 10 women and their children. The next 5 years passed relatively peacefully. That's just McCoy, who, as I said, learned to drive moonshine from the root of tea. This plant is called Cordyline terminalis in Latin. Put his production on a grand scale, and as a result the sailors drank themselves to delirium tremens. Saw McCoy tied a stone to his neck, and in a fit of delirium tremens, threw himself off a cliff into the sea. In 1799 year, a drunken Matthew Quintal attacked his companions in a fit of delirium tremens, and was killed by Edward Young and John Adams. A year later, Edward Young, who had asthma, also dies, leaving John Adams as the last man on the island. Adams falls into melancholy and goes into a violent binge. During another attack of delirium tremens, he saw colorful hallucinations and, apparently, experienced some kind of religious ecstasy. And the next morning, John Adams breaks the moonshine machine and tells the women and children that from now on they will live strictly according to the Holy Scriptures. And they didn't really resist. In general, the survival of the colony was entirely on the shoulders of women, as men were constantly drinking and killing each other. The women brought with them standing dishes, and it was passed from mother to daughter. They cooked their food in Polynesian stone stoves. It consisted mainly of yams, taro, and bananas with coconuts. Occasionally, pork, poultry, or goat meat fell on the table. The clothes were first sewn from bounty sails, then replaced with loincloths and skirts made of tapa, a traditional Polynesian fibrous fabric beaten out of the bark of a paper mulberry tree. And for survival, this island was more than a favorable place, except for, so to speak, the internal climate. All these years, the islanders lived in complete isolation. By the way, according to one of the women, around 1797th year, when several men were still alive, a ship was spotted at Pitcairn. Some time later, a second ship appeared, and several sailors came ashore picking coconuts. At this time, the inhabitants of the island hid in the jungle, and the sailors never found out that the island was inhabited. In general, the next 10 years went relatively well. Adams, who suddenly fell into religion, tried to build an ideal Christian society on the island. He preached sermons to women, followed the morals, and fathered children. So most of the modern inhabitants of the island are his descendants. On the 6th of February, 1808, the American whaling ship Topaz docked at Pitcairn Island, and found that it was inhabited. Captain Matthew Folger even sends messages about it to England. However, apparently, she was not interested in it at that moment. The country was occupied by the Napoleonic Wars, and tiny islands somewhere in the tropics were of no use to it. A few years pass, and on the 17th of September, 1814, two ships, the Briton and Tagus, who were hunting for the American warship Essex, as if rediscovering the island and its inhabitants. Going ashore, the sailors saw a strange picture. It really resembled an ideal Christian society in some way. Later, they compared this island to Paradise Lost. And these sailors bring news about the island to England, and there it arouses a very lively interest. But one must understand the mood in 19th century England. These codes of honor of a gentleman, moral principles and other rules, which have always been strong in English society, gradually began to weaken, and many did not like it. Then, as now, many shouted that life used to be better, but now only debauchery, corruption. And society had a request, first of all, for religiosity, and secondly, for a certain island of untouched morality, under which Pitcairn Island was very well suited. So, 25 years of isolation have ended. The news about the wonderful island attracted a lot of attention around the world, and increasingly they began to be visited by ships going from India and Australia to South America or England. Moreover, almost every ship that approached the island made generous gifts, and exchanged surplus stocks for provisions that were produced on the island. During this period, oranges were brought to the island, houses began to turn from huts into stone buildings, and clothing and lifestyle became quite European. On the 5th of March, 1829, John Adams dies at the age of 65. And by that time there were 66 people living on the island. Despite his dark past, Adams was mourned as the father of the island. The community has lost a leader. After some time, adventurer George Nobbs sails to the island, who quickly becomes the leader of the community. He was a veteran of the war in Chile and quickly took power under him. However, in October 1832, an even darker personality arrives on the island. His name was Joshua Hill. He declares that he is the governor of this island and has been appointed by the English crown. None of this was true. This adventurer quickly banished George Nobbs and anyone who dared to question his regalia. He demanded honors and lived like a king on this island. He led arbitrary imprisonment and other harsh punishments for the slightest misdemeanors. And for a few years the island was plunged into tyranny again. The exposure occurred only in 1838 year. Of course, this man had nothing to do with the British government. The impostor is expelled in disgrace. And from 1838 to 1848, the 8th year can be called a rare period of calm on the island. The population exceeded 100 people. There appeared its own constitution. They traded meat, vegetables, fruits with passing ships, and lived more than well. After some time, the population exceeded 200 people. Moreover, there were practically no visitors there. They were all descendants of those same rebels with bounty. Moreover, in 1882, a law was passed prohibiting foreigners from settling on the island. Later amendments were made to allow people to remain useful to the island, but so far, most of the island's inhabitants are descendants of the mutineers from the bounty ship. And it seemed, live for yourself and rejoice, but in 1886 year, there is another revolution in the life of the island. Preacher John Tay, who belonged to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, resides on it. And as you probably already guessed, the islanders are changing their religion. They stop eating pork, change their religious rites, and go to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Moreover, apparently, the preacher John Tay lied to the locals that everyone in England has long accepted Adventism. And Pitkins, as good citizens, now also need to join the church that the king and queen have accepted. And by the way, Adventism is still the main religion on the island, which at that time still retained the reputation of a kind of isolated corner of morality. This isolation ended only in 1914 with the opening of the Panama Canal. Huge cruise liners began to pass through the island, filled with thousands of passengers who wanted to go ashore and personally see this amazing corner. Many people from the community began to move to neighboring islands and to Australia. The isolation was over, and it would seem that all the madness of the island has remained somewhere in the past as an interesting legend. But no. And now let's fast forward to our time. 2004 year. By this time, there are only 47 people living on the island. The population has greatly thinned. At its peak, there were about 300 residents, but most moved to Australia. So, in the 2004 year, 7 of the 47 inhabitants of the island were convicted of having relations with minors. And among them was the mayor of Pitcairn Island, whose name was Steve Christian. As you probably guessed, this is a direct descendant of the same Fletcher Christian who organized the mutiny on the bounty ship. And it would seem that this is all. But no. In the 2010 year, the new mayor of the island was convicted on the same charge. Thus, Pitcairn Island has the largest number of convicts under not the most pleasant articles. 8 people out of 47. The island now lives off tourism, and so far most of the population are descendants of those same bounty rioters.